Okay, so this is basically going to be like a current events type class. The inspiration that I had for doing this class comes from this quotation that I have up on the slide that says scientists and politicians are calling the 2020s the crucial decade for the climate. And it comes from the Guardian magazine from a few weeks ago in early October. And the article was referencing the recent climate summit, COP26. And I just included part of the quotation because it contains the sort of alarming part, and that's what I want to focus on. This idea that the world is really gripped by the urgency of what's now being referred to as the climate crisis. So that's really where we're going to focus. I think it's a relevant topic because people all over the world are affected by climate change, by severe weather. In Kingston, or not Kingston, in Canada, we have people who are affected by flooding, and there's just stories all the time coming up about how people are affected by severe weather. And I think that it's important that we stay informed about what's going on in the world, and that we're able to project a very hopeful prospect to the world when things look very bleak. And a verse that comes to mind is 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, which it says, "Sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." I think for Christadelphians, it's really easy to say, we don't need to worry about what man is doing to the earth, because we know that when Christ returns, then all things will be restored and things will be fixed up. So we expect Christ to return soon, so we can maybe become a little bit dismissive of some of the issues that are facing the world. But the problem with that is, if we portray an attitude like that, then it shows it's as if we're indifferent to the suffering that's happening and the worries that people face. And I think we're missing an opportunity to connect with a large portion of the population who's either directly impacted by climate change, or certainly impacted on a mental level, the worry that people are facing. So it's an opportunity that we can connect with people over this topic because of the hope that we have. And certainly, if you follow any news, the outlook for the planet looks incredibly dim. There's stories every single day, and it can almost be stressful. I've included this slide here. It's kind of a joke, but there is no planet B, and that's reflective of the attitude that people have. And I don't know if people have been hearing this term come up. It's in the news a lot. People are talking about a term called eco-anxiety. And it's a term that was coined by the American Psychiatric Association. It goes back to 2017. And part of the definition is that it's a chronic fear of environmental doom. And it's a real situation that people face because they're living in a circumstances with the sense that there's an impending doom and there's very little that they can do about it, and the situation feels very hopeless. So if you meet people who are expressing that sort of feeling, it's really an opportunity, I think, to explain why we feel differently, why we don't feel that the situation is hopeless. And I think that comes from our understanding of the gospel message that's not shared by all Christians. Our understanding of what God is doing with the earth is not necessarily shared by mainstream Christianity. So this can be a bridging point, so to speak, that we can use to talk about our faith. So I also want to present a biblical perspective on climate issues as well, and that will come up later on in the class. And I hope that there's opportunity for people to share their views as well. I do find Zoom conversation a bit like talking on a two-way radio, so I tend to just hold off on the end because I get really muddled. It's almost like based at 39, who wants to comment on this? I just find it impractical for me the way my style works. But if you do have a burning comment, maybe the best thing is just drop it in the chat and we'll come back to it. Okay. Now, the gospel message is incredibly straightforward when you think about it. And this is why we feel peace in spite of the news and the doom that's facing the world. It comes down to the fact that, God appeared to a human being, the creator of all things. He made an appearance to a man, a human being. His name is Abram, and he promised him specific land that he walked up and down in it, and he viewed the land, and he promised him a kingdom through his seed. It was a very literal promise, and it's not a spiritualized reference to land beyond the skies up in heaven. Otherwise, why would God have told Abram to walk around and go view the land? Like that wouldn't really make any sense. And faithful believers like ourselves from every race, every generation, we can become subjects of this same kingdom by subjecting ourselves to its king, the Lord Jesus Christ. And since the gospel is really that simple, and it's in direct contradiction to a view that the earth will be destroyed, it gives believers a real sense of peace in the face of all the alarming news that we hear about. So in this first part of the class, I want to look at some of the science, kind of the science perspective as to why people feel the way that they do. And I think that that's important because it helps us to relate to what people are experiencing. So this part, we're just going to consider kind of the scope of the problem. This is a quotation from NASA. And so they say, in brief, the effects of human-caused global warming are happening now, are irreversible on the timescale of people alive today, and will worsen in the decades to come. So according to NASA, global warming is definitely the result of human activity that's damaged the environment. And they've damaged it in a way that's beyond repair within the scope of people who are alive today. And that really is a terrifying prospect for people, because not only do you have to convince people to start changing things now because of the harm that's been caused, but they're not even going to experience any benefits to that. You're talking about doing things now that are going to affect this hypothetical generation of people down the line who will hopefully have an inhabitable earth. So it's difficult to convince people to make big sacrifices in that situation. The mechanics of it, why people believe that it's human caused, is because of the creation of these gases, in particular carbon dioxide, whether it's from farming or transportation or manufacturing. These gases are emitted into the atmosphere and they absorb heat. So the sun warms the earth, and naturally that heat dissipates from the earth. But these gases trap a large amount of heat, and over time that warms the surface of the earth. So that's the mechanism of it. And tracking of the temperature of the earth started back in around 1880, where prior to that, they didn't have a very accurate tracking system. But since 1880, they've had thermometers or monitors all over the earth, and they've tracked the temperature. And since that time, the earth's temperature has gone up by a little over 1 degree Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. I'm not very good with those conversions, but 1 Celsius. And that's pretty significant when you think about just the enormous, the inconceivable amount of energy that it would take to warm all of the oceans, all of the land masses of the earth by even a single degree. Like, it's just an inconceivable amount of energy. So it's also true that not all scientists agree that this model is accurate. They don't all believe that climate change is the result of human activity. So for those scientists in that camp, there's really not all that much that can be done because they view it as purely a natural phenomenon. But the one thing that they do all agree on is that the Earth is warming up. Nobody really debates that. They only debate whether it's caused by humans or not. And there are severe weather conditions that are happening as a result of the Earth warming up. So here are some of the issues. This is where I probably would have liked to have more participation, but I'm just going to sort of fly through this for the sake of time. There's a lot of discussion right now about wildfires and how climate change is leading to broader and more frequent wildfires all over the earth. One of the things that's happening is that there are these beetles that destroy forests, and they're starting to thrive at higher and higher altitudes because the climate's warmer. They're destroying more forests, and then they become prime for combustion, for fire. So it accelerates the problem because then that fire releases vast amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and the problem worsens. In addition to that, as far as people who live in those areas, they become prone to mudslides and they become very uninhabitable. Water scarcity is another problem that people are facing, whether it's to do with not having drinking water. It also causes concentration of pollutants because as there's less water, the pollution in the water gets more and more concentrated, which leads to illness. Animals seeking water get more and more desperate, so it increases the number of interactions that people have with animals, which leads to disease transmission. And then finally, sanitation is an issue. If you can't even have water to drink, you're going to be a lot less concerned about sanitation, or you're just not going to have clean water. So that's one of the issues. Flooding, I like this meme here, but this one's quite relevant in our own area. There's been lots of flooding in Canada and just very unpredictable water levels. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the NOAA, the temperature increase, I'm just reading a quotation from a website that I forgot to put on the slide, regional and seasonal temperature extremes, reducing snow cover and sea ice, intensifying heavy rainfall, and changing habitat ranges for plants and animals, expanding some and shrinking others. Now, there are lots of other big topics that we could talk about with respect to climate change, and I'd love to hear more like what people have been reading about. I find it very interesting. I am very big on outdoors activities. So I've always had kind of a natural interest in the environment because I love to fish. I tried to embed some trophy pictures into my slide, and I thought, nah, it's going to get people off topic. So I took those out, but I do have a big interest in this just because I love the outdoors and I really love nature. And I try to spend as much time outside in nature as I can. But probably you've all heard different stories about the effects of climate change. I want to move from the scientific side to talk about more of the political side. And this is getting into the problem that man actually cannot fix this problem. And that's really what's causing great political unrest and polarization within the communities because the topic is highly polarizing. And I'd just like to read a quotation from Luke chapter 21 that I know people reference quite a bit lately, but I think it's a very fitting verse that describes the sentiment that's in society. Luke 21 verse 26. Men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. So as Bible believers, we have an opportunity to set an example of people who love God's creation, who aren't afraid of the events that are happening in the world, because our faith is grounded in evidence-based truth. It's possible that people around us, friends and neighbors, will take notice of the peacefulness that we portray, And we can use this topic of caring about the earth and the environment as a reflection of our faith in God as the creator. And that is a value that we share with other Christians as well. So it can be an easy way to talk about your faith with other people, with other Christians, to use this as a bridging point. Now, in the absence of hope that's Bible-based, people in society are turning to activism, environmental activism, and political activism out of almost a desperation as a strategy to try to save the planet. There are organizations like Greenpeace, and they confront the government and these big corporations, and they try to fight back against climate change. Unfortunately, these organizations usually resort to vigilantism and criminal behavior. And so these activist groups don't offer much hope to improving climate change. And actually, they just increase the civil unrest, and law enforcement is frequently needed to get involved in calm situations that are really caused by these activist groups. On the Greenpeace Canada website, they state their mission as follows. Greenpeace is an independent campaigning organization which uses nonviolent creative confrontation. I like that. I underlined that because I thought that was a good way of putting it. To expose global environmental problems and to force the solutions. I like that wording, which are essential to a green and peaceful future. Kind of a contrast there, but creative confrontation and forcing their views. Greenpeace's goal is to ensure the ability of the earth to nurture life in all its diversity. Therefore, Greenpeace seeks to protect biodiversity in all its forms, prevent pollution and abuse of the Earth's ocean, land, air, and fresh water, end all nuclear threats, promote peace, global disarmament, and nonviolence. It sounds exactly like Revelation 21, but their mechanism is slightly different than what Christ has in mind. This is an article, I might just kind of race through this. This was something that I was reading about some Greenpeace activities that they our law enforcement is saying, like, you know, these activities are actually making people unsafe. They are committing crime, and this was the view of the law enforcement in Canada towards the activism of Greenpeace. Here's another image of an activist group. They're known as Sea Shepherd or Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, and they're led by a guy called Paul Watson, and he's recruited a very large following. I believe they have 12 ships now, and they all have fancy names. And they use the ships to go around and interfere with poaching activities and any kind of ocean-related environmental efforts. Now, I don't have to admit, it kind of looks fun. I don't know how. I think it might be fun to get out there and sink some of these poachers with water cannons. I'm not going to lie, that is kind of tempting, but it's just not in line with what the model that Christ has taught us. It's not the way that Christ taught us to deal with these kinds of confrontation. And again, it just reinforces that man isn't really equipped to deal with the scale of the problem, and so it's becoming more desperate, and people are trying desperate measures to solve the problem. Not only that, but the small uncoordinated efforts by countries all over the world aren't having a big impact, because to have a really significant impact requires global cooperation, and it's just not happening. That's where this COP26 summit comes into place, that happened back in November. So I'll give a little overview of that, just in case people are unfamiliar with what that is. Back in early November, it was a 2-week-long summit. It actually takes place every year except for last year because of the pandemic. It's an annual United Nations climate summit. It's called the COP26. It stands for Conference of the Parties, and year 26, because they go back to 1994 minus last year. And it's from countries that all ratified this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So you'll see this acronym UNFCCC, which is an attempt to coordinate efforts to preserve the Earth by cooperation with countries all over the world, or who are in the United Nations. So this year in 2021, it happened in Glasgow, Scotland, during the first 2 weeks of November. And there were delegates from 200 countries, or nearly, I think it was 197 countries. And they make pledges, and they try to negotiate plans to reduce the carbon emissions from each country. So it does sound good. It sounds like there's this broad spirit of cooperation between nations to make a difference and try to negotiate some meaningful changes. The main goal that they have is to keep the Earth from warming up above 1.5 degrees. So you may come across this slogan. Oh, I didn't put it on there, but the slogan is to keep 1.5 alive. An alternate version of it is stay alive, keep 1.5, or something to that effect. And it stems from the idea that they view it as an absolute necessity to prevent the Earth's temperature from exceeding 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. So going back to 1880, anything above 1.5 is considered catastrophic to humanity. And the unfortunate part really is that they're already saying that we're not going to reach net zero until 2050. So if they put all the things into place right now that need to be done, we still won't reach net zero until 2050. So it's people alive, again, won't even benefit from the changes that they're committing to. The slogan, it goes back to what happened in 2015. There was something called the Paris Climate Accord. And the product of these summits is something that's called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. They are essentially pledges that countries make that they measure themselves, and then there's actually very little accountability to United Nations. And that's a big problem, because they make pledges, they say they're going to do things, but there's no mechanism within United Nations to make countries be accountable, to force them to actually follow through on the pledges. And critics of the process say this is really nothing but PR. It's not actually going to have any meaningful change. So another thing that was pointed out by some critics in a news story on CNN, they discovered that, or they highlighted that there were more than 500 lobbyists at the COP26 from the oil and gas industry. So the oil and gas industry had more delegates at COP26 than any other country represented there. So I want to take a look at the tone that this is creating, because there were many speeches made during COP26. And what strikes me from the speeches is there's not a very hopeful tone. You know, our goal as people who want to show the truth to people is to offer a hopeful message. And these efforts are not offering people very much hope at all. They're very negative. This was Greta Tunberg. People probably have heard some of her speeches. She's I guess you would call like a youth activist, and she's been inciting youth all over the world to demonstrate, to walk out of schools, and to try to take action and to get really riled up about things, because it's their future in particular that's going to be affected. So there's some very emotionally charged speeches that she's been giving. This is what she said during COP26. Many are starting to ask themselves, what will it take for people in power to wake up? But let's be clear, they are already awake. They know exactly what they are doing. They know exactly what priceless values they are sacrificing to maintain business as usual. The leaders are not doing nothing. They are actively creating loopholes and shaping frameworks to benefit themselves and to continue profiting from this destructive system. This is an active choice by the leaders to continue to let the exploitation of people and nature and the destruction of present and future living conditions to take place. The COP has turned into a PR event where leaders are giving beautiful speeches and announce fancy commitments and targets, while behind the curtains, the governments of the global North countries are still refusing to take any drastic climate action. So my main point there is just that the tone of that is not very encouraging. And Barack Obama gave a speech as well at COP, and he commends Greta for the work that she's doing and getting the youth riled up and protesting and walking out of schools and being angry. And he's quoted as saying to the youth, "Stay angry." That's what I've put on the top of the slide there. That's a quotation. And my point again is just I don't see how this is going to be constructive at all. So if this is our hope in the world, that we're going to have these leaders and these events to fix the problems, it doesn't really paint a very optimistic picture at all. And that's where we come in, because we can show people why we know that the earth is not going to be irreversibly damaged by people, because the gospel message, as it is declared in the Bible, requires an inhabitable earth, and only God will be able to sort it out. So joining political activist groups is not going to have any meaningful effect, and it's not in line with being a disciple of Christ. Luke chapter 21 again, which I read part from earlier, in verse 10 and 11, it says, "Then said he unto them, Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven." Now, when we read this verse, I find it's very hard to imagine that we're far from Christ's return. So it's exciting, but it's also a little bit scary. When the situation seems so bleak, it's tempting to just become cynical and to be uncaring about climate change. But again, like, the problem with that attitude is it is not helpful or constructive to people who might be responsive to a more positive message of hope, to say, I understand eco-anxiety. I get why you would feel that way, but we can feel confident that God will intervene, because the fulfillment of the gospel absolutely depends on it. There's no other way for God to give the kingdom to the descendants, to Abraham's seed, if there's no earth that's inhabitable. Now, in the last part of the class, I want to consider some Bible verses that teach us specifically about having an attitude of respect for the earth, a respect for animals, and other people. I think I might just kind of glance through this slide. It really is just dealing with the idea that a lot of people associate a belief in human-caused climate change with being a liberal, and so therefore there's like a distrust of science, saying, well, only liberal scientists say that there's climate change. I'm not liberal, so I'm just going to carry on polluting and ravaging the earth because I don't believe what they say anyway. I'm not going to go into great detail about it. There's an article there that if you're interested in, I can send you the link to it. But the term that they use is anthropogenic. Anthropogenic means human caused. What is God's perspective? Well, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. So after God had completed his creative work, he comments on his creation that it was very good. I think the implication for us is that as we observe the planet and we observe the beauty and the systems that are built into it, all these things that make life possible, we should appreciate it as the work of the Creator, and we should cherish, and it should evoke a reverence for God just by observing the complexity, the beauty that of what God has made. So how could we justify not loving and caring for what he's made? And Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, it says, "And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it." The word translated as dress it in the King James Version, it conveys the meaning of service or labor. So Adam was assigned a job. He had something that he had to do in the garden. He had to perform work in the land. And the second word there, keep it, it has the meaning of being like a guardian or preserving the garden. So God intended for Adam to play an active role in taking care of the garden. He wasn't intended to be neglectful of the garden, to abuse the garden, or destroy things in the garden. He had a role to play that was assigned by God. To me, the implication of that is that humans, like God intended humans to have that same type of interaction with the earth, like to admire it, to care for it, to look after it. And he's put it into our hands as something to love and see his own character in the earth and to look after it. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." This verse to me indicates that God gave man a very special responsibility, like a manager, to manage the earth. There's an article that I came across that was curious to me. I'd never heard this before, but it described how some early Christians used this passage to validate basically pillaging the resources of the earth, because they're like, see, God gave it to man to just take whatever we want and put it to use for man. And so these early Christian groups, hopefully not Christadelphians, I don't know who these groups were exactly, but they believe they're fully justified in just ravaging, pillaging, and plundering the earth because they thought this was a God-given or divine right that they had. But that's in stark contrast to the role that Adam was given, having a role of a caretaker over the earth. It's not in line with that, because if you're a caretaker over the earth, you would want to protect the resources and prevent damage to the natural habitats of the animals. I think if we're to try to understand this word subdued, it maybe is more in line with the idea of taming. Just like if you're going to grow a garden, you don't go out to your garden and just destroy the land. Like you do have to do work. You have to remove unwanted vegetation, oxygenate the soil, and monitor the moisture, and you have to sort of tame the earth, but you care for it in a careful way that respects the land. And whenever you don't do that, bad things happen. That's one thing I've learned when you read about the science of farming and things. If you don't do it, if you don't follow, good farming practices, you will actually ruin the land. Now, aside from the special role of being a caretaker over the earth, I think there are other reasons why we should respect and cherish the earth. There are several verses that show a connection between God himself, the attributes of God, and the creation. Romans 1 verse 20, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So clearly the things that we observe and come to understand of the complexity of the earth and the beauty are something that we should use to reflect on the attributes of the Creator. And I think that's reason in itself to be mindful of how we view the earth. Job chapter 12, verse 7 to 10, but ask the beasts and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens and they will tell you, or the bushes of the earth and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. So that verse sort of aligns with the verse from Romans, the same kind of idea that even the animals themselves reflect attributes of the Creator. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 6, you are the Lord, you alone. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens with all their host, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them, and you preserve all of them, and the host of heaven worships you. So the summary of these three verses is just that since the creation really is a reflection of the creator, it should make us adore the earth and magnify God in how we appreciate what he's made and admire it. Okay, the last part of this that I'll, don't worry, I'm close to being done here. I wanted to give some time for people to talk. The last part here is just looking at some verses from the law that I found interesting. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 6, it says, if you come across a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. I think that's an indication, of protection of that species, because if you take the mother and the eggs, then you don't have the ability to sustain the population. You're going to destroy the population. So it's just a simple little passage in the law that shows like God expects you to be mindful of the creatures and care for them. And yes, that could be because they provide sustenance, but also I think there's pretty clear evidence there that preservation of that species is something that we should be mindful of. Preservation of trees, Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 19. When you besiege a city for a long time, making war against it in order to take it, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them. You may eat from them, but you shall not cut them down. Are the trees in the field human, that they should be besieged by you? I think that's very interesting that the soldiers encompassing a city were to not damage the trees. They're meant to preserve them, and they would be for food production, but the way the passage is worded, it's almost like you're to look at them like they haven't done anything wrong to you, so don't cut them down. They're my trees. It's like the way that reads to me. And then this passage here in Exodus chapter 23, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. So even though this is your enemy's animal, it still deserves to be treated well. So saying, you can't just walk past this poor animal. You have to care for it. You have to look after it. So there's built right into the law this command to be to treat animals well. And that's basically the final verse that I wanted to look at. So I'll just wrap up with this concluding slide. I found this instead of conclusion, I went with takeaways. I like when people say the takeaway lessons, and this sign comes from a restaurant, so it's supposed to be a bit of a joke, but I know you can't really laugh at my terrible jokes on Zoom. It feels like you're talking to yourself. But anyway, my conclusions from what I studied is, first of all, that we should, of course, trust in God to overcome. So maintain the peace that we have, maintain the hope, because if we're not looking after that part, we're not going to be useful in portraying the gospel to other people. So we have to be well, and we have to be full of hope and full of light, and that's our number one conclusion from this. The second conclusion is I think it's important to be informed and to understand the challenges that people, our friends and neighbors, are facing. And we can display an affection for the creation, and this magnifies God's name, and it helps us to be relatable to people who are very fearful. And finally, tell your friends and your neighbors about the hope and the peace that you have. That's a little homework assignment, is tell somebody I'm going to try and do it too. I'm not always the best at that. I like to just have a quiet existence, but I think this is an excellent task to go and just make a goal, a concrete goal. This week or next, I'm going to tell somebody about why I think that we can have a hope separate from this a hope that contrasts the eco anxiety that's present in the world.